Hello, my name is Tia, also known as Costume Fiend because I'm both evil and excessively fond of dressing up. I was at Barnes & Noble's a few weeks ago, and while I was getting my sister's birthday things, I decided to pick up a copy of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Much like when I picked up a copy of The Odyssey, it felt like one of those classics I may as well own since I actually like them. I'd also been thinking about fairies, so it was kind of on theme. When I was paying, the cashier and I got into a brief conversation about modern day Shakespeare adaptations and which ones were the most successful. Since this is a topic I've thought about for a while, I decided to pick 3 for right now, but leave the door open to talk about more adaptations later. The first 2, 10 Things I Hate About You, Rest in Peace, Heath Ledger, and Delivers from Eva are based on The Taming of the Shrew, and the third one will be Romeo Must Die, Rest in Peace to Aaliyah, which is pretty straightforwardly a Romeo and Juliet adaptation. 10 Things I Hate About You is probably one of my favorites when it comes to modern day Shakespeare, which is kind of funny when you consider the fact that The Taming of the Shrew is probably to this day controversial. Like, is it meant to be satire? Are we playing it completely straight? It's considered one of the comedies, but while sexism is present in many of Shakespeare's works reflective of the time period and the culture, The Taming of the Shrew is arguably the most aggressive about it. After all, even if we should take the play as satirical, it is ultimately about a man taming a disagreeable woman by gaslighting and abusing her, which you would think would be impossible to modernize. But 10 Things I Hate About You not only manages to successfully do so in the late 90s, but even in 2025, it's still massively enjoyable to watch. I think there are a few reasons for this. The first reason being that it knows that it's an adaptation of a Shakespeare comedy. Comedies about high school in general are already offering up a heightened version of that experience with teens played by adults and causing enough drama to give soap operas a run for their money. So turning that up just a little bit more allows the audience to relax and not take everything too seriously. The second reason this movie works is slightly more depressing, but it's true. We still live in a sexist patriarchy. Fathers in America may not be putting a price on their daughter's virginity anymore, and it's now slightly less taboo for a younger sister to be married before her older sister, but that doesn't mean young girls are free to do as they please. It's entirely believable that Kat and Bianca's father would make a rule that Bianca couldn't date until her older sister Kat does, and in turn, Kat's rebellious attitude makes perfect sense, as does Bianca's desire to fit in and experience life. With that in mind, the third reason 10 Things I Hate About You works, in my opinion, is that it doesn't ignore the fact that the Bianca of the play, is actually shown to be pretty clever and not nearly as sweet as she comes across. After all, she's the one that proposes the setting her sister up scheme in order to get what she wants. That gives her character dimension, and interestingly enough, I feel like the older I get, the more I appreciate her journey. I even appreciate her and Cameron more too. I still love seeing her stand up for Cameron and her sister at the prom. Finally, the last reason this film works for me is the way it goes about setting up Kat and Patrick. Obviously, in a lot of older rom-coms, the whole stockings love trope is problematic, but I also at the same time, from a storytelling perspective, understand it because we kind of need characters to be in the same vicinity, and people can't always come up with a good enough reason or excuse to put them together. Like I said, since this is a heightened Shakespeare-inspired comedy, I'm less upset about that, and I think, like I said, overall, they make it work, because the challenge is to both, first of all, endear the audience to her and not make Patrick an abusive asshole, and Patrick, coming from a clearly less privileged background than the other students, helps make sense of the fact that he'd do something somewhat immoral for money. He, like Kat, doesn't have a strong respect for authority and doesn't care much about what other people think, which gives them a reason to fit well together without the bet. In particular, the scene that makes it clear that Patrick actually starts to like Kat for real involves her backing up into Joey, the resident douchebag's car, after he purposely blocks her ability to leave her parking spot. Since this happens fairly on in his attempts to woo Kat, it kind of ends up feeling less icky and more genuine, despite there still being some lying. Also, again, because this is based on Shakespeare, the convoluted nature and the ethics of the whole betting trope with regards to dating is something I can overlook for entertainment, especially since Patrick also makes the very notable choice not to kiss Kat when she's drunk and actually make sure she gets home safe, even though he has no real incentive to do so. He also pretty much spends all of the money on Kat, so he doesn't really actually benefit that much on a personal level. There's plenty more that could be said about this movie, but overall, I love how they portrayed the relationship between the two sisters, and I kind of low-key think that's at the heart of the film, on top of the romance. And they still allowed, of course, for some Shakespearean shenanigans. Similarly, Deliver Us from Eva also puts us in a version of the world that feels extremely heightened to allow for a suspension of disbelief. It also, funnily enough, stars Gabrielle Union as the titular Eva, who also played Bianca's best friend in 10 Things I Hate About You. So there's a fun bit of trivia for you. Deliver Us from Eva deviates from the original story a bit more and actually gives Eva 3 sisters who are all already partnered in some capacity. Unlike in the original and the high school rom-com, the goal isn't to set Eva up so they can pursue anyone. The goal is to set Eva up so she stops interfering in all the relationships. Since Eva is both the oldest and had to take on a lot of responsibility after their parents died, all the sisters are understandably very deeply attached to each other, and they all take Eva's word very seriously. Eva's intense personality is clearly a result of that responsibility and trauma, as well as heartbreak connected to her first love. LL Cool J's character Ray does get paid, but he is shown to be a bit of a womanizer, so he also sees getting Eva to date him like a test of his skills. It's a bit slimy, but it works, and it helps that, like with Kat and Patrick, we see that there's some genuine interest after Ray sees Eva at her most intense. Ray also manages to, with no tricks, chow down on and enjoy Eva's extremely spicy wings that no one else can stomach, which sets us up to see that they're a good match even without Ray's flirtation skills. Honestly, my main gripe with the movie is that the partners of Eva's sister pretty much experience no consequences for their actions. Unlike in 10 Things I Hate About You, there was definitely more malicious intent behind them setting Eva up, and the sisters had no idea, versus Bianca, who again sets the whole thing in motion. It kind of also makes the movie feel slightly more sexist, and not just because it's from the early 2000s. Other than that, though, it's a solid adaptation for what it is, because as I mentioned earlier, the original work is seemingly impossible to modernize. That being said, I feel like we've retired the dating someone on a bed trope, and to be honest, that's probably for the best, since while I still enjoy these movies going forward, I'm not really sure how you would update that now. On almost the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we have Romeo and Juliet, which is arguably the play that's been adapted the most, in part because it's so easy to translate to many cultures. I mean, you've got the two houses alike in dignity that hate each other thing. It's a simple setup, and the forbidden romance angle is able to be dramatized further by the fact that the leads are teenagers. However, family rivalries know no bounds, so the Romeo and Juliet characters can honestly be almost any age. The reasons for the hatred between the families can vary, and in the case of Romeo Must Die, they choose to go the gang rivalry route. It also has the added bonuses of both gangs being run by people that are both marginalized in this country. The choice to go with a black Juliet and an Asian Romeo works really well when you remember the earlier sentiment that the houses must be alike in dignity. If one has significant social power over the other, or if one is just straight up the oppressor, then that kind of changes the point of the story and can lead to some unfortunate implications. Black and Asian people both have it hard in America for a variety of reasons, and the characters being in gangs makes it work for the amount of death needed in the story that you can't get away with as easily with other lines of work, though I'm aware that there are Romeo and Juliet adaptations that don't really take into account those scenes or character deaths, and there is a Romeo and Juliet movie about rival pizza place owners, so I don't think they get into that at all. Anyway, back on track before I go down a weird path. Aaliyah as Juliet is very sweet, and it always makes me wish she was still around when she's on screen, despite the fact that the romance is downplayed because of the age difference between the actors, in conjunction with some real life stuff I don't feel like getting into. Jet Li as Romeo does a good job at being the dutiful son, but also coming across as charming to Aaliyah, whose character is clearly trying to avoid the life her father and brother have chosen. It's always nice to see them together on screen, and I like that this movie has them bonding over their shared family drama, and in particular how they feel about their respective brothers. Han naturally feels guilty as the older sibling who wasn't around when his brother was killed, and Trish feels conflicted because of the distance she was putting between her and her brother, in no small part due to the kind of danger that led to his death. Speaking of death, here's another one of my signature smooth transitions. This version of Romeo and Juliet, in spite of what the title would have you think, actually results in, spoiler alert, both characters staying alive. There's certainly a version of this movie that could exist that ends more closely resembling the original text, but on a personal note, I'm kind of glad we got this one. Even though a confirmation of the character's romantic relationship would have been nice, I'm perfectly fine taking what we got. The story still manages to hit home the message of how senseless all the violence caused ultimately ends up being over things that truly don't matter. That to me is what makes it a good retelling, because sometimes, when people do the everyone lives route, those kinds of messages can get lost, but I think this hammered it home in a way that still works. Other than that, feel free to leave a like if you liked, subscribe for more nerdy rambling, and as always, have a good one.